I let my wife have all the time to think she wanted and watched her indecision destroy our marriage until I forced her to choose and things changed. You know what drives a man absolutely insane? Living with someone who treats every single decision like it's a life or death situation that requires a full congressional hearing. My wife has turned "I need time to think" into an art form, and I've been the fool enabling it for way too long. It started small, like most relationship poison does. Where should we go for dinner? I need time to think about it. What movie should we watch? Let me think about it. Which car should we buy? I really need time to think. At first I thought she was just being thoughtful, careful with our choices. How wrong I was. 3 years into this marriage, and I've realized something that should have been obvious from day one. She doesn't need time to think. She needs time for me to make the decision, so she can avoid any responsibility for the outcome. Genius strategy, really. If things go well, she gets to enjoy the benefits. If things go poorly, well, it wasn't her choice, was it? Last Tuesday, we were sitting at the kitchen table with our real estate agent. Perfect house, perfect price, perfect neighborhood. The kind of opportunity that doesn't come around twice. The agent was looking at us, waiting for an answer. The seller is motivated, ready to close quickly. And what does my wife do? She looks at me with those big innocent eyes and says, "This is such a big decision. I really need time to think about it." I watched our agent's face change. The professional smile was still there, but I could see the disappointment. Another deal slipping away because someone can't make a simple yes or no decision. The house sold to someone else 3 days later. Someone who actually knew what they wanted and wasn't afraid to commit to it. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was watching her blame me for not pushing harder for the house. Apparently, when she says she needs time to think, what she really means is that I should convince her to say yes. I'm supposed to be both the decision maker and the mind reader. You want to know what really opened my eyes? I started paying attention to how she acts with other people. At restaurants, she orders immediately. At the store, she grabs what she wants without hesitation. With her friends, she makes plans on the spot. But with me, everything becomes this enormous, complicated process that requires careful consideration and multiple discussions. I realized I wasn't dealing with someone who was naturally indecisive. I was dealing with someone who had trained me to be her personal decision-making service. Every time she said, "I need time to think," what she was really saying was, "I need you to take responsibility for this choice so I don't have to." The breaking point came last week. Her sister called with news that their parents are selling the family cabin. They're offering it to Family First below market value, but we need to decide fast. It's been in their family for 40 years. Our kids love that place. It's a steal at the price they're asking. She looks at me after the call and says those magic words, "This is really important. I need time to think about it." Something clicked in my brain. Not anger, not frustration, clarity. Pure, crystal clear understanding of what needed to happen next. I smiled at her, really smiled, and I said, "You know what? You're absolutely right. Take all the time you need." She seemed surprised by my response. Usually I'd start listing pros and cons, trying to guide her toward a decision. Not this time. This time I meant exactly what I said. She could have all the time in the world to think. In fact, I was going to make sure she got exactly that. Every single decision from now on was going to get the full time to think treatment. No more me jumping in to save the day. No more me making choices so she could stay comfortable in her little bubble of indecision. If she wanted time to think, I was going to give her more thinking time than she ever imagined possible, starting right now. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before in our marriage. I started keeping a record. Not because I'm petty, but because I needed to see the full scope of what I was dealing with. You can't fix a problem you don't fully understand. I grabbed a small notebook and started documenting every single time she used her favorite phrase. The results were more shocking than I expected. By Wednesday afternoon, I had already recorded 12 instances, 12 times in less than 2 days that she needed time to think about something. Should we have the neighbors over for dinner this weekend? Time to think. Which insurance plan should we choose during open enrollment? Time to think. Should she sign up for that cooking class she's been talking about for months? You guessed it. Time to think. But here's where it gets interesting. I stopped doing what I always did. Instead of waiting a day or two and then making the decision myself, I simply said, "Okay, let me know when you've decided," and then I walked away. The first few times, she looked confused, like I'd forgotten my lines in a play we'd been performing for years. She'd give me these little hints, these openings for me to jump in and rescue her from having to actually commit to something. I ignored every single one. Friday evening, she was standing in the kitchen, staring at a pile of bills. Normal routine would be her asking if we should pay them now or wait until next week, me suggesting we just handle them, and then me sitting down to write the checks while she found something else to do. Not this time. She turns to me and says, "I'm thinking we should probably deal with these bills. What do you think?" I looked up from my book. "Sounds like you need time to think about it. Take as long as you need." The confusion on her face was priceless. "But they're due next week." "Then I guess that's your deadline for thinking," I replied, turning back to my book. She stood there for a full minute waiting for me to cave. When I didn't, she walked away. The bills stayed exactly where they were. The weekend came around and she was clearly expecting our normal routine. She'd mention a few options for weekend activities, claim she needed time to think about what sounded best, and I'd pick something so we didn't waste the whole day waiting for her to decide. Saturday morning, she started the familiar dance. "There's that art festival downtown, or we could check out that new hiking trail, or maybe just stay home and work on the garden." "I need to think about what sounds good." "Great," I said, pouring my coffee. "I'll be in my workshop. Let me know what you decide." By Sunday afternoon, we hadn't left the house. She kept waiting for me to suggest something, to take the lead like I always did. I kept waiting for her to actually make a choice. We both waited. The weekend disappeared. The really fascinating part was watching her try to figure out what had changed. She'd start conversations the same way she always had. But when I didn't jump in to save her from having to commit to anything, she'd get this lost look, like someone had moved all the furniture in a room she thought she knew by heart. Monday morning brought a small crisis. Her gym membership was up for renewal. They'd been calling for weeks, offering a discount if she renewed by the end of the month. She'd been thinking about it since they first called. She comes to me with a renewal form. "I'm still not sure if I should stick with this gym or try that new place across town. I really need more time to think about it." I nodded thoughtfully. "That does sound like something that requires careful consideration. The deadline's today, right? So, you've got—" I checked my watch, "about 8 hours to finish thinking." Her eyes widened. "But what if I can't decide by then?" "Then I guess you'll have decided not to renew," I said with a shrug. "That's still a decision." For the first time in our marriage, I watched her actually panic about having to choose something. She spent the entire day going back and forth, calling the gym, researching the other place, making lists of pros and cons. You know what happened? At 4:47 p.m., she called the gym and renewed her membership. Just like that, no committee meeting required, no extensive consultation process. She made a choice and moved on with her life. That evening, I added a note to my little record book. Day 6 of the experiment. First actual decision made under pressure. It took her exactly 8 hours and 13 minutes to choose something she'd been thinking about for 3 weeks. I was starting to see a pattern when the consequences of not deciding became more uncomfortable than the fear of making the wrong choice. Suddenly, her decision-making abilities returned. Amazing how that works. By the second week, the cracks in our routine were becoming impossible to ignore. The house had this strange, suspended feeling, like we were living in a permanent state of maybe. She finally noticed something was wrong when her friend called about a double date they'd been planning. Normal protocol would be her saying she needed to think about it, me eventually saying yes to keep the peace, and then her spending the week before the event asking if I really wanted to go. This time, when she hung up the phone and said, "I need to think about whether we should go," I just nodded and went back to reading my newspaper. An hour later, she tried again. "So, about dinner with them on Saturday? Still thinking?" I asked without looking up. "Well, yeah, but I mean, what do you think?" "I think you said you needed time to think about it, so think about it." The frustration was starting to show. "But they need to know soon so they can make reservations." I folded my newspaper and looked at her directly. "Then, you better finish thinking quickly." She stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Why are you being so weird about this?" "I'm not being weird. I'm being respectful of your need to think about things. Isn't that what you want?" 3 days later, her friend called back. The restaurant was booked, solid, and they'd missed their chance. When she got off the phone, she turned to me with this accusatory look. "We missed out on a really nice evening because you wouldn't help me decide." I almost laughed. Almost. I didn't realize making decisions was my job. "I thought you were perfectly capable of choosing whether or not you wanted to have dinner with friends. That's not what I meant, and you know it." "Actually, I don't know what you meant. You said you needed time to think. I gave you time to think. What exactly did I do wrong?" She couldn't answer that. "How do you explain that you expect someone else to make your decisions for you without admitting that's exactly what you're doing?" The real breakthrough came when her mother called about Thanksgiving plans. This was always a production. Her mom would suggest hosting. She'd say she needed to think about it, then spend 2 weeks asking me what I thought we should do. I'd usually end up calling her mother back to confirm while she found reasons to be unavailable for the conversation. This year, when she hung up and started the familiar routine, I was ready. Mom wants to know if we're coming for Thanksgiving. I told her I'd call back after I had time to think about it. Sounds good, I said, not even looking up from my laptop. Don't you think we should discuss it? You said you needed time to think. I'm giving you time to think. But this affects both of us. Everything affects both of us. That's never stopped you from needing time to think before. I watched her process this. You could actually see the gears turning as she realized the trap she'd built for herself. Every time she'd use that phrase, she'd been making unilateral decisions to postpone decisions. Now she was upset that I wasn't participating in her postponement strategy. This is different, she finally said. How? Because it's important. So was the house we lost. So was the cabin your parents offered us. So was dinner with friends. Everything's important when there are consequences, isn't it? The silence that followed was deafening. She stood there, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water, trying to find an argument that made sense. There wasn't one. 2 weeks passed. Her mother called 3 more times. Each time she'd tell her mom she was still thinking about it. By the third call, I could hear her mother's exasperation through the phone. Finally, on a Wednesday evening, she came to me looking defeated. I don't understand what's happening here. Why won't you help me make decisions anymore? I closed my book and gave her my full attention. I'm not the one who stopped making decisions. You are. You've spent our entire marriage avoiding the responsibility of choosing anything, and you've trained me to be your backup decision maker. I'm done being your safety net. That's not what I do. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed my notebook. Her eyes went wide when she saw it. April 15th, needed time to think about dinner plans. April 16th, needed time to think about vacation dates. April 17th, needed time to think about which contractor to hire. April 18th. I kept reading, date after date, decision after decision, all requiring her special thinking time. By the time I finished the first week's entries, her face had gone pale. You've been keeping track. I wanted to understand the scope of the problem. In 3 weeks, you've needed time to think about 47 different things. 47. And you know what's interesting? The things that truly matter to you, the things you care about, you decide instantly. It's only when you want someone else to take responsibility that you suddenly need all this thinking time. She sat down hard in the kitchen chair. I didn't realize. Of course you didn't. Because every time you said those magic words, I jumped in to save you from having to actually commit to anything. Well, congratulations, you've got all the thinking time you could ever want now. The third week brought real consequences, and suddenly, her thinking time wasn't so comfortable anymore. Deadlines don't care about your decision-making anxiety, and reality has a way of forcing choices whether you're ready or not. The first crisis came from our kids' school. Parent-teacher conferences needed to be scheduled, and they were filling up fast. The form had been sitting on our counter for 10 days while she thought about which time slots would work best. She came to me Tuesday morning, form in hand, looking stressed. I still haven't figured out the best times for these conferences. I need to think about our schedules more carefully. I glanced at the form. Looks like there are only 3 slots left. Better think quickly. Can't you just help me figure out what works? I could, but then I'd be making the decision for you, and you said you needed time to think about it. By Thursday, there was 1 slot left. Friday at 3:00 p.m., right in the middle of when she usually went to her yoga class. She stared at that form like it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. This is the worst possible time, she complained. Then you should have thought. Faster, I replied, stirring my coffee. She called the school that afternoon and took the Friday slot. She missed her yoga class, spent the whole week bitter about the timing, but you know what? She made a choice and lived with it. The second crisis was bigger. Her company's health insurance enrollment was ending, and she'd been thinking about whether to switch to the high-deductible plan or stick with the traditional coverage. 3 weeks of thinking, and the deadline was Monday. Sunday night, she was sitting at the kitchen table with insurance brochures spread everywhere, looking like she was trying to solve quantum physics. I just can't decide which plan is better. There are so many variables to consider. I looked over at her mountain of paperwork. Seems like you've had plenty of time to consider them. But what if I choose wrong? What if we end up paying more? What if something happens and we don't have the right coverage? What if you miss the deadline and have no coverage at all? Her face went white. That possibility hadn't occurred to her. In her mind, someone would always swoop in to save her from her own indecision. Reality was proving to be less accommodating than I had been. She stayed up until 2:00 a.m. that night, finally submitting her enrollment online with just hours to spare. The next morning, she looked exhausted, but also oddly proud of herself. "I figured it out," she announced over breakfast. "Great. See how easy it is when you actually have to decide?" The look she gave me could have frozen water. But the real test came when her sister called about a family reunion. Their family does this big gathering every 2 years, and this time they were planning it for our anniversary weekend, the kind of scheduling conflict that would normally send her into a week-long spiral of analysis paralysis. She hung up the phone and immediately started the routine.
"I need to think about whether we can make this work. It's our anniversary, but it's also family, and we haven't seen everyone in so long, but we already talked about going away that weekend. I didn't even look up from my book."
Sounds complicated. Better start thinking. What followed was fascinating to watch. Instead of the usual back and forth where she'd hint at what she wanted me to decide, she actually started working through the problem herself, making pro and con lists, checking our calendar, calling the hotel to see about rescheduling our reservation. 3 days later, she came to me with a solution. "I figured out how we can do both. If we leave for our anniversary trip on Friday instead of Saturday, we can spend Saturday at the reunion and still have Sunday and Monday together." It was a good compromise. Actually, it was a better solution than I would have come up with, but instead of congratulating her, I just nodded and said, "Sounds like you thought it through." She looked almost disappointed that I wasn't more impressed, like she'd been expecting praise for doing something she should have been doing all along. The 4th week brought the biggest test yet. Her boss offered her a promotion, more responsibility, better pay, but it would mean longer hours and some travel. The kind of career opportunity that could change our financial future. She came home with the offer letter, hands shaking slightly. "This is huge. I don't know what to do. I need time to really think about this carefully." I looked at the letter. The salary increase was substantial. The position was exactly what she'd been working toward for years. When do they need an answer? 2 weeks. Then you've got 2 weeks to think about it. For the first time in a month, she looked genuinely panicked. "But what do you think I should do?" "I think you should think about it. Like you said, this isn't fair. This is my career we're talking about." "Exactly. Your career, your choice, your responsibility." She spent those 2 weeks actually analyzing the opportunity, researching the department, talking to people in similar roles, weighing the pros and cons. By the end of the 2nd week, she'd made her decision. She took the promotion. And for the first time in years, when someone asked her how she decided, she didn't look at me for backup. She explained her reasoning herself. She owned her choice completely. I was starting to see glimpses of the woman I'd married, the one who knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to go after it. The 5th week brought the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when her indecision would cost us something that actually mattered, and she'd have to face the real consequences of her thinking game. Her brother called with news that rocked our world. Their grandfather's vintage motorcycle collection was being sold. The old man had passed 6 months ago, and the family was finally settling the estate. There was one bike in particular, a 1967 Triumph Bonneville, that had been promised to her father years ago. But her father had decided he was too old to ride anymore and wanted to pass the opportunity to us. The catch? We had 48 hours to decide. The estate was moving fast, and if we didn't commit by Wednesday morning, they'd put it up for public auction. This wasn't just any motorcycle. I'd been restoring vintage bikes as a hobby for 15 years. This particular Triumph was worth at least $30,000, maybe more to the right collector. They were offering it to us for $12,000. It was the deal of a lifetime. She looked at me after her brother's call, and I could see the wheels turning. This was important to me. She knew how much I loved working on these machines, knew I'd been searching for a Triumph like this for years, but it was also $12,000, and it was a decision that needed to be made quickly. "This is a lot of money," she said slowly. "I really need time to think about whether we can afford this right now." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "How much time do you need?" "I don't know. At least a week to really go through our finances and figure out if this makes sense." "We have 48 hours. That's not enough time. This is a major purchase. What if we regret it? What if something comes up and we need that money for something else?" I stared at her for a long moment. "So, you're saying no?" "I'm saying I need time to think about it, which, given the deadline, is the same as saying no." She got defensive. "Why can't you understand that I need time to process big decisions? This isn't like choosing what to have for dinner." "You're right. It's not. It's like choosing whether to buy the house that sold to someone else while you were thinking. It's like choosing whether to accept your parents' offer on the cabin that went to your cousin instead. It's exactly like every other opportunity you've thought your way out of." The argument that followed was our biggest in years. She accused me of being impulsive, of not caring about our financial security, of pressuring her into decisions she wasn't ready to make. I accused her of using indecision as a weapon, of hiding behind thinking time to avoid responsibility for anything that mattered. We went to bed angry. She spent Tuesday at work, presumably thinking. I spent Tuesday researching the bike's value, checking our finances, and making a decision. Wednesday morning came. The deadline was 10 o'clock a.m. At 9:30, she was still thinking, still going through the same circular logic she'd been trapped in for 2 days, still waiting for some perfect moment of clarity that would make the choice obvious and risk-free. At 9:45, I called her brother. "We're going to pass," I told him. "She needs more time to think about it." The bike sold at auction 3 weeks later for $28,000. When I told her the final sale price, something broke inside her. Not just disappointment, but recognition. She finally saw what her indecision was costing us. Not just money, but opportunities, experiences, and the chance to take calculated risks that could improve our lives. She sat on our couch that evening staring at nothing and said the words I'd been waiting to hear for months. "I have a problem, don't I?" "What do you think?" I asked. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Even now you're making me decide for myself, because you're the only one who can." That's when she broke down, really broke down. Years of frustration and fear came pouring out. She told me about growing up with parents who criticized every choice she made, and how she'd learned to avoid decisions to avoid being wrong, how she'd found someone who would make choices for her so she never had to face that criticism again. "But you're not my parents," she said through tears. "And I turned you into something you never wanted to be. I made you responsible for my entire life." I handed her tissues and waited. This was her moment of reckoning, and she had to walk through it alone. I've been so afraid of making the wrong choice that I stopped making any choices at all, and now I've caused us something that really mattered to you. "The bike wasn't the real problem," I said quietly. "The bike was just the symptom." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "How do I fix this? How do I learn to be decisive again? The same way you learned to be indecisive, one choice at a time." She looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years: determination. "I want to change. I want to be the kind of person who can make decisions and live with them. I want to be your partner, not your dependent." "Then stop asking for time to think and start thinking instead." She took a deep breath. "I can do that. Can you? Or do you need time to think about it?" For the first time in weeks, she smiled. A real smile. "I can do that." Decision made. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened fast enough to surprise both of us. Sometimes people need to hit rock bottom before they're ready to climb back up. And losing that motorcycle was her rock bottom moment. The very next day, she proved she was serious about change. Her gym called about a special training package they were offering. Normally, this would trigger a week-long analysis session followed by me having to research trainers and make the final call. Instead, she listened to their pitch, asked 3 specific questions, and said yes on the spot. When she hung up, she looked almost shocked at herself. "I just decided right there on the phone. How does it feel?" Terrifying, but also kind of amazing. That became the pattern. Each decision got a little easier, a little faster. She started setting artificial deadlines for herself. 15 minutes to choose a restaurant, 1 day to decide on weekend plans, 2 days maximum for anything involving money. The real test came when her parents called about Christmas plans. This had historically been a month-long negotiation involving multiple family members, hurt feelings, and eventually me making executive decisions to end the chaos. This year was different. Her mom started the usual routine. "We need to figure out where everyone's going to be for Christmas. Your aunt wants to host, but your dad thinks we should do it at our house, like always. And your sister thinks we should try that new restaurant downtown." I watched my wife take a deep breath. "Mom, let me call you back in 1 hour." With our answer, she hung up and turned to me. "What works better for you, Christmas at their house or Christmas at the restaurant?" Simple question, direct. No endless analysis of every possible scenario. Either works for me. "What do you prefer?" "The restaurant. Less cooking stress for everyone, and we can actually enjoy the day instead of working all morning." She called her mother back 55 minutes later. "We'd like to do the restaurant. Can you make the reservation for everyone?" Her mother was so stunned by the quick, definitive response that she just said yes. Christmas dinner was the best we'd had in years. But the biggest change came when she started applying her new decision-making skills to things that really mattered. 3 months after the motorcycle incident, she came home with news that floored me. "I've been thinking about starting my own consulting business," she said over dinner. "I know the industry. I have the contacts, and with my new promotion, I've proven I can handle more responsibility. That's a big step, it is. And 6 months ago, I would have spent a year thinking about it until the opportunity passed. But I've done the research, I've run the numbers, and I think it's worth the risk. She pulled out a folder, business plan, financial projections, client target list. She'd done her homework. I want to give my notice next month and start building my client base. What do you think? Here's what I didn't say. That I was proud of her for taking initiative. That the business plan looked solid. That I thought she'd be successful. Here's what I did say. What do you think? She smiled. I think I'm going to do it. And she did. 6 months later, her consulting business was profitable. A year later, she was making more than she ever had at her corporate job. But more importantly, she was making decisions daily, living with the consequences, and thriving under the pressure. The woman who used to need time to think about which grocery store to visit was now running client meetings, negotiating contracts, and building a business from scratch. One evening, we were sitting on our deck, watching the sunset. She turned to me with a thoughtful expression. I owe you an apology. For what? For making you responsible for my life for so many years, for putting you in the position of having to be the adult in every situation. That wasn't fair to either of us. I could have said something gracious about how we both learned from the experience. Instead, I told her the truth. You're right. It wasn't fair, and I enabled it for way too long because it was easier than dealing with the conflict. We both had to change. Yeah, we did. She was quiet for a moment. Do you ever miss it? Having someone who deferred to you on everything? I laughed. Are you kidding? Do you know how exhausting it was being responsible for every choice we made? I feel like I've been carrying a 100-pound backpack for years, and someone finally took it off my shoulders. Good, because I never want to go back to being that person who was afraid of her own decisions. Even when you make the wrong ones, especially then. At least when I make the wrong choice, it's my wrong choice. I can learn from it and do better next time. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, she got a text from a potential client wanting to set up a meeting. She looked at her calendar, checked her schedule, and responded with 3 available time slots. No consultation, no lengthy analysis, no need for time to think, just a decision made quickly and confidently by someone who finally understood that perfect choices don't exist, but making choices and learning from them is how you build a life worth living. She looked up from her phone and caught me watching her. What? Nothing. Just appreciating the woman I married finally showing up again. She smiled and kissed me goodnight. She was always here. She just needed to remember how to trust herself. The next morning, she woke up and made 3 decisions before breakfast. And the day after that, 5 more. Because once you remember how to be decisive, once you stop being afraid of the consequences of choosing, the world becomes a much more interesting place to live in. And me, I got my partner back. Not someone who needed me to think for her, but someone who could think alongside me. Someone who could make tough calls, take calculated risks, and own the outcomes. Someone who finally understood that time to think is worthless if you never actually decide. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.